Okay, so it's also quite strongly linked with things like heart disease and diabetes. So this is just yet another reason why you would not necessarily want to eat an explicitly calorie-restricted diet, okay? Here's another little thing about diet, and I'm getting onto this idea that certain diets might have metabolic advantage, okay? It's a very contentious issue. I'll just discuss it with you briefly, but let's just start with this. There is something in nutrition known as the thermogenic effect of food. Now, basically, when you eat food, right, not all of that food has the potential to be stored as, say, fat or something else in your body. Some of that energy will be lost, generally as heat, which is where the term thermogenic comes from. So heat-inducing, if you like, effects from food. So it is a bit like putting fuel on a fire. Now, for example, if you had some protein in your body, you might break it down into amino acids and then reassemble it into protein again, and that wastes energy, okay? So this is one of the reasons, okay, that certain foods might have what's called a metabolic advantage, because if you lose a lot of energy, okay, from a food in this way, then less of it is going to be available for you to store as fat, fundamentally, okay? So what's the most thermogenic food stuff, or rather macronutrients specifically? No. It's protein, actually, okay? So there's an argument for possibly, you know, a relatively protein-rich and not very carbohydrate-rich diet being useful here. The other thing is that when you adopt, say, a low-carbohydrate diet, you might want to produce some glucose, okay, from protein, and that also sort of wastes energy. So that all brings me on to this basic question, is a calorie a calorie? So I know you'll be familiar with this concept. Many people that work in the weight loss field, most doctors, most researchers say a calorie is a calorie. It's irrespective of the form of the calories, it's only the number of calories that count here. Now, I get the logic of that, maybe, all right? But here's the thing, just intuitively now, does that really make sense? I mean, if you look at the many different ways that different macronutrients affect hormone levels and metabolism or whatever, and thermogenic effects, it doesn't, for me, feel quite right that that is how it really is, okay? So let's just very, very quickly summarize each of the major macronutrients, okay? Carbohydrate. Now, this stimulates insulin secretion, some of them a lot of insulin secretion, which, you know, makes fat go into fat cells and basically sticks it there, right? And also you get spikes in blood sugar, which are inflammatory, which could disrupt your ability to respond properly to leptin. That isn't looking so good as far as I'm concerned, okay? Actually, fat looks significantly better for me, okay, because less insulin secretion would mean more opportunities for fat to get out of fat cells and not get in there in the first place, possibly. And then the other thing is certain fats are actually anti-inflammatory, notably the omega-3 fats that we find in things like oily fish. And what of protein? Well, protein does stimulate insulin secretion, but generally not as much as carbohydrate, and it might have some metabolic advantage through those mechanisms that I just talked about. So if you were to think about this, just looking at all of this data, you might say, well, actually, possibly the best diet for us in terms of optimizing weight would be relatively high in fat, moderate in protein, and low in carbohydrate. Now, here's the question. Is there any evidence for that? Has anyone actually looked at it? Well, of course they have. A number of researchers over the years have taken diets of different composition and fed them to people to see whether they have similar or different effects on weight, okay? Now, there are plenty of studies that show no difference. There really are plenty of studies, okay? So to be fair, we should at least nod in their direction. However, a lot of these studies are relatively short in duration, and sometimes you need a fair amount of time to be able to determine whether something is beneficial or not. Anyway, there is some evidence, okay, that there is indeed different effects of different calories on weight. One of the first studies was this one, done in the 1950s, where they took a group of individuals, some of you will be familiar with this study maybe, and they put them on really quite extreme diets for a short amount of time, but they also found quite significant differences on changes in weight relatively quickly here. The best diet was the one high in fat, which you absolutely would predict, by the way, from what we know about the impact of different macronutrients on those factors that we talked about earlier. Now, there's a whole bunch of other studies that show this as well, by the way. And you can say, well, it wasn't perfectly done and they weren't locked up in a ward and blah blah blah, but there is at least some evidence that suggests that basically when you compare diets of similar calorie content with different composition, okay, then we get different effects on weight loss, okay? So here's the next thing. Even if that isn't true, let's imagine a calorie is a calorie after all, right? Maybe that's true. It's really difficult to tell, actually. But even if it is true, here's one thing that I think is really important. If someone's going to lose weight and sustain that weight loss happily and healthily, they can't really afford to get very, very hungry, okay? Because when people get hungry, it really saps at the resolve, and willpower is a little bit like a muscle. There's evidence to suggest that when you exert your willpower, it makes you weaker for a while afterwards, okay? So it is really very hard going through life being sort of permanently semi-hungry or very hungry, all right? So do we have any advantages here from eating a diet, basically, that is relatively low in carbohydrate? And I would say possibly yes, because protein, calorie for calorie, appears to satisfy the appetite more than fat or carbohydrate, okay? So, a bit of protein in the diet, not necessarily such a bad thing. Also, possibly now, high-fat diets can promote weight loss because they can promote weight loss. So you've got fat loss coming out of the fat cells. Where does it go? Into the bloodstream. And then where might it go? Well, possibly into the muscles, right? So what's going to happen there? You can now use that fat for fuel. So one of the concepts is that when you're eating a diet that is causing true weight loss from your fat cells, you may not be very hungry because what you're not eating is being supplemented by your fat. You've now become like a hibernating bear, if you like, okay? Which isn't bad. Just think about that for a moment. You're not very hungry, you're energized, okay, and you're losing fat. That is a fantastic state to be in, but you will never get in that state, obviously, if you're eating generally a very carbohydrate-rich diet. The other thing is carbohydrate-rich diets don't tend to be very satisfying, do they? And a lot of people will have blood sugar disruption as a result of eating high carbohydrate diets, so up and then down, then you get this sort of false hunger and food cravings for more carbohydrate, and then you're on this roller coaster, which can be difficult to get off unless you restrict some carbohydrate, basically. So here's what happens basically to individuals that basically adopt a lower carbohydrate diet very often, and you may know this from your own experience. They'll very often eat less, and often substantially less. Now, I had breakfast a couple of mornings ago with Eric Westman, and he told me, I don't think you'll mind me telling, are you here, Eric? No, okay. I go, oh, I see. And he told me, I'm just not hungry. And that is not atypical at all for people that restrict carbohydrates. And typically they will eat a lot less, not because they're consciously restricting carbohydrate, but because they're just not very hungry. That is not a bad thing in my view, all right? So here's a few reasons for not eating a low-fat, calorie-restricted diet. Suppression of the metabolism, okay? Reduced energy expenditure, because very often people will move less. Nutrient deficiencies, potentially. Hunger and preoccupation with food, all those kind of issues. You might have a biochemical state through the production of insulin that is actually predisposing to fat gain. Insulin resistance, which can make people hungry and tired. Leptin functioning, not so good. So what might that happen? Lower metabolism than people should have, and possibly more appetite than they should have. We haven't finished. Reduced leptin functioning. So as a result here of possibly triglycerides blocking the uptake of leptin into the brain. Raised cortisol levels, not ideal. Generally would predispose to muscle loss and fat gain. And basically a diet that has limited ability to sate the appetite properly, and therefore an enhanced risk of hunger and food cravings and all of the problems that go along with that. Now, I don't want to sound glib, but I do want to say good luck with that, okay? Honestly, I sometimes say to people, it's not that diets don't work, fundamentally they can't work, okay, for all but a small minority of people, all right? So what's the solution? You probably want to avoid foods that are disruptive to blood sugar, don't you? Okay, and therefore insulin, and also leptin. And you probably want to put a bit more emphasis on protein and fat maybe, and not so much on rubbish carbohydrates. That basically equals a low-carb diet. It could also be a paleo diet. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Some people ask me, is that low-carb, paleo, whatever? I'm actually for all of these things. I'm for anything, okay, that's better than what the person was doing before, quite frankly. Now, one of the great things, I don't use a lot of branding. I tell you, when I write a book, I hardly talk about low carb or paleo, because some people have resistance to that. They think low carb and then it's Atkins and yeah, he's a quack and blah, blah, blah. You get that a lot. There's a major problem in the UK. So I don't even talk about it. I just thought, this is how we should eat. And then sometimes at the end of a lecture, someone will go, is that a bit like Atkins? And I'll go, yes. But the thing is, they have no resistance to it now. You see, because it's made sense in their brain. Anyway.